My name is Ashley. I am 32 years old. On my birthday, we were sitting in a crowded booth at a local Altoona diner when my younger sister shoved a brightly wrapped box across the table. I opened the paper to find a commercial DNA testing kit. Before I could even read the label, she laughed loud enough for the neighboring booths to hear and said, "Maybe this will explain why you look like another man's mistake." I did not yell. I did not throw the box back at her. I just stared at the worn vinyl seat while my mother scolded me for looking overly sensitive. 6 months later, when our family estate lawyer summoned us to his Des Moines office and froze her inheritance because of the results from that exact test, she could barely breathe. Before I tell you how a cruel joke uncovered a 30-year-old secret and dismantled my family, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories if you believe people who mock others eventually build their own traps. The air inside the diner smelled like fried pork tenderloin and old coffee. It was a typical Tuesday evening in central Iowa, filled with local farmers and shift workers seeking shelter from the biting wind. My feet throbbed. I had just finished a 9-hour shift standing behind a cash register, wearing a faded polo shirt that smelled like cardboard boxes. Across the cracked laminate table sat my sister, Kelsey. She took up her side of the booth with an effortless sense of ownership. Her camel-colored wool coat draped over the seat, and the keys to her least luxury sport utility vehicle rested next to her untouched side salad. At 30, she worked as a real estate agent, using our late father's agricultural connections to build her local brand. Beside her sat our mother, Sandra. Sandra spent the entire dinner adjusting her sensible cardigan and scanning the room to ensure no one from her church congregation was watching us too closely. Our father had passed away just 4 months prior. He left behind a sprawling 500-acre farm in Story County. The grief still lingered, but a heavy, unspoken tension regarding his estate had quickly taken its place. The land was tied up in a transitional probate period, drawing interest from corporate agricultural buyers willing to pay top dollar for prime Iowa soil. Kelsey already acted as if the impending commercial buyout was her personal victory lap. She frequently steered our conversations toward her mounting debts and how quickly the trust liquidations needed to happen. "You are awfully quiet for the birthday girl, Ashley," Kelsey remarked, swirling her iced tea. The condescension in her tone was sharp. "Just tired from my shift," I replied, keeping my voice level. I traced the edge of my water glass, trying to ignore the judgment radiating from my mother. Sandra frowned, a tight line forming on her lips. "There is no need to pout. Ashley, your sister went out of her way to organize a celebration for you despite her busy schedule. You could at least pretend to appreciate the effort." That was when Kelsey reached into her designer tote bag and retrieved the small rectangular box. She slid it across the table. It stopped inches from my hand. She delivered her punchline about me being another man's mistake, soaking in the cruel satisfaction of her own joke. The clatter of silverware from the adjacent booth magnified. A passing patron glanced over, turning their head quickly as the temperature at our table plummeted. The insult hit my chest sharp and precise. She used a public space to weaponize my lifelong alienation, reducing my existence to a punchline while reinforcing her status as the rightful heir to our father's legacy. My throat tightened. Instinct urged me to stand up and defend myself. Instead, my hands gripped the edge of the table. I focused on the fraying seam of the vinyl booth, fighting the hot, humiliating sting of tears threatening to spill over my eyelids. I looked to my mother, waiting for a single word of defense. Sandra just sighed, leaning in closer. "For heaven's sake, Ashley, stop making that wounded face," she whispered harshly. She checked the room again, terrified the neighbors might witness a scene. "It is a simple joke. Your sister paid good money for a trendy gift, and you are trying to ruin dinner. Put the box in your purse and act your age." I swallowed the lump in my throat, the bitter taste of stale coffee lingering on my tongue. The estate lawyers were already circling the farm, Kelsey was drowning in hidden real estate debt, and my mother was willing to let me be publicly degraded just to maintain the illusion of a flawless Midwestern family. The rhythmic beep of the barcode scanner became the soundtrack of my existence over the next 3 weeks. I picked up every available double shift at the supermarket just to keep my heating bill from entering collections. Standing on a thin rubber mat for 10 hours a day makes the bones in your heels throb with a dull, relentless ache. The harsh fluorescent lights of the store illuminated the stark divide between my reality and the world my family inhabited. I would watch customers pile their carts high with organic produce and premium cuts of meat while mentally calculating exactly how many days I could stretch a single bag of rice and a carton of eggs. My financial reality was a tight, rigid wire I balanced on every single month. I lived paycheck to paycheck in a drafty apartment where the brutal Iowa winter wind seeped through the window frames, forcing me to sleep in a heavy college sweatshirt just to stay warm. In stark contrast, my sister Kelsey treated money like an endless renewing resource. Her social media feeds were a parade of open houses, closing day celebrations, and designer coffee cups held in front of the steering wheel of her leased luxury vehicle. She projected the image of a thriving real estate mogul dominating the Des Moines suburban market. But working the cash register teaches you how to read people. And growing up with Kelsey taught me how to spot her specific brand of desperation. I noticed the subtle signs of her financial strain. She frequently used credit cards that required multiple swipes to approve a basic transaction. And her designer winter coats were always from clearance racks of past seasons. She was funding an artificial high society lifestyle on a mountain of revolving debt. She desperately needed a rescue rope, and she viewed our late father's estate as her personal lottery ticket. Our father was a stern, unyielding agricultural businessman who commanded respect across central Iowa. He built his legacy on 500 acres of prime Story County farmland. It was rich, dark soil that produced high-yield corn and soybeans year after year, a testament to the strong work ethic that defined the heartland. He valued grit, early mornings, and measurable success. Yet despite my constant efforts to prove myself by working grueling hours, I always felt like a stranger standing in the margins of his life. Kelsey, however, mirrored his relentless ambition, or at least the loud performance of it. Now that he was gone, that expansive farmland was locked in a dense transitional probate period. Corporate agricultural buyers were circling the estate, offering sums that stretched into the millions. Eager to secure such a lucrative piece of Midwestern real estate, the legal process was complex, requiring endless documentation and environmental assessments. Kelsey treated the entire probate affair as her exclusive domain. My phone buzzed constantly with her passive remarks. She sent text messages complaining about the slow pace of the estate attorneys, framing every bureaucratic delay as a personal affront to her future plans. She texted me saying the corporate buyers wanted to survey the north acreage and told me not to worry about attending the meetings. She wrote that I would not understand commercial zoning laws anyway, and suggested I just focus on bagging groceries so I did not miss my hourly wage. She reduced my life to a blue-collar punchline. Treating my rightful half of the inheritance as an inconvenience she had to tolerate until the checks were cut. One evening, I returned to my cramped apartment after a punishing 14-hour shift. Driving home, I had passed the endless stretches of harvested cornfields, the barren stalks dusted with fresh snow. The landscape was beautiful but unforgiving, much like the man who had raised me. I dropped my keys on the chipped Formica kitchen counter, sitting right there, exactly where I had tossed it on the night of my birthday, was the brightly colored DNA testing kit. The glossy cardboard seemed to mock me under the dim, flickering light of the kitchen overhead fixture. Kelsey's cruel joke echoed in my tired mind, suggesting I was another man's mistake. I stared at the box, feeling the accumulated weight of 32 years of alienation pressing down on my chest. I never looked like my father. I lacked his sharp jawline and his imposing stature. My mother always brushed away any questions about our physical differences with irritated scowls and sharp reprimands. demanding I stop asking foolish questions. The sheer frustration of being the perpetual family scapegoat finally boiled over. I did not possess a grand strategic vision. I was simply an exhausted cashier searching for a single shred of truth in a family built on illusions. I ripped the plastic wrapping off the box and pulled out the sterile plastic vial. The instructions were simple. I tore open the swab packet, rubbed the cotton tip firmly against the inside of my cheek, and snapped it into the preservation fluid. I sealed the vial inside the prepaid shipping envelope. I did not even take off my heavy work coat. I walked right back out into the freezing night, marched 2 blocks down the icy sidewalk, and dropped the envelope into the blue postal collection box on the corner. The heavy metal flap clanged shut, sending my genetic code into the mail system out of pure, unadulterated spite. I desperately hoped the laboratory would reveal some distant heritage, some logical explanation for why I never fit into their picture-perfect portrait. The agonizing wait for the results consumed the following month, overlapping heavily with my daily anxieties. My aging sedan required a new alternator. Wiping out the meager savings I had managed to scrape together from the holiday overtime shifts, every dollar spent tightened the vice around my chest. I watched my bank balance dwindle to double digits, while Kelsey sent me photographs of premium kitchen appliances she planned to install in her home the moment the probate cleared. The disparity in our circumstances fueled a quiet, burning resentment. I was not a calculating villain plotting a hostile takeover of the estate. I was just a tired woman trying to keep the heating on, hoping the inheritance would simply pay off my student loans and afford me a reliable vehicle to get to work safely in the snow. Kelsey viewed the farmland as a stepping stone to extreme wealth, while I viewed it as basic survival. The weeks blurred into a grueling routine of scanning items, sorting produce, and ignoring my mother's occasional phone calls demanding I apologize to Kelsey for ruining my own birthday dinner. I refused to engage in their toxic dynamic, choosing instead to protect my fragile peace through silence. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, trusting that the complex probate process would eventually conclude and allow me to separate my life from theirs forever. I survived on discount coffee and marked down bakery items from the end of the shift, keeping my head down and my uniform ironed. Then came a rainy Thursday morning. I was sitting in the employee break room during my 15-minute rest period, sipping lukewarm tap water from a paper cup. The air smelled of burnt toast and industrial floor cleaner. I pulled my phone from my pocket to check the time. A fresh notification sat at the very top of my screen. It was not a message from my sister complaining about property taxes or a missed call from my mother. It was a benign, sterile corporate email from the genetic testing laboratory. The subject line read in crisp, dark letters, indicating that the processing phase was finished and the genetic profile was ready to view. My pulse spiked. A sudden sharp thud against my ribs. I stared at the glowing screen, entirely unaware that opening this digital portal would unearth a devastating secret and trigger a catastrophic chain of events that would shatter the foundation of my entire family. I navigated to my desktop computer, my hands trembling as the harsh glare of the monitor illuminated the small, cluttered room. The silence of the apartment was suffocating, punctuated only by the distant hum of the refrigerator. Every detail of my life seemed to have been violently erased, replaced by an unfamiliar, terrifying reality. I typed in the web address of the genetic testing laboratory, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as my heart raced in an erratic, unpredictable rhythm. The screen loaded, revealing the familial matching section. I expected to see a straightforward breakdown of my ancestry, the typical European heritage markers of an Iowa farming family. Instead, the portal delivered a staggering shock. I stared at the bold, undeniable letters, confirming a 100% biological match to a woman named Helen, my late father's paternal aunt. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the sheer impossibility of the results. Helen lived on a sprawling cattle property near Dubuque. She was the stern, imposing woman who had gifted me a handmade quilt when I was a teenager. A rare moment of warmth from my father's side of the family. The genetic data was undeniable, cementing my place on my father's side of the family tree. If I was his biological daughter, then the cruel joke delivered at the Altoona diner was nothing more than a hollow insult. But my analytical mind, sharpened by years of balancing tight budgets and calculating grocery inventory shrink, snagged on a glaring inconsistency. I tapped the search function within the familial matching database. My sister Kelsey loved broadcasting her life choices. Just last year, she had proudly submitted her own saliva sample to this exact same commercial company. She had spent an entire Sunday dinner bragging about tracking her genetic fitness traits to optimize her expensive boutique gym workouts. If her profile was active, it should be linked directly to mine. I typed Kelsey's unique user handle into the search bar. The loading icon spun for a brief, agonizing second. Her profile populated on my screen, displaying her smiling, heavily filtered profile picture. I scrolled down to the shared genetics section. The results delivered a staggering shock that seemed to drain the oxygen straight out of my living room. The database confirmed we were half-siblings. We shared a significant block of maternal DNA, proving we both came from our mother. But the paternal connection column was a glaring, undeniable void. The percentage of shared DNA on our father's side was 0. I read the numbers 3 times, my brain struggling to process the impossible math. There was no glitch. There was no laboratory error. The horrific truth crashed down on me with the force of a collapsing roof. I was not the affair baby. Kelsey was the pristine, curated image of my mother fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. Sandra was the staunch, judgment-casting Iowa churchgoer who organized the Sunday school bake sales and lectured young women about traditional family values. She wore modest cardigans, quoted scripture during minor disagreements, and projected an aura of unimpeachable moral superiority. Yet, beneath that pious facade, she had carried a massive deception for 3 decades. She had engaged in a hidden affair, became pregnant, and passed the child off as my father's own. She had allowed me to grow up feeling like a defective outsider while showering her illegitimate daughter with unearned praise and affection. My initial reaction was not cold triumph. I did not feel a rush of vindication or a sudden surge of power. The sheer gravity of the secret triggered a profound, visceral rejection within my body. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My stomach roiled, twisting into painful knots. I dropped the phone onto the faded sofa cushions, clamped a hand over my mouth, and stumbled blindly down the narrow hallway. I reached my tiny bathroom just in time, gripping the edges of the cold porcelain sink. I threw up until my throat burned with stomach acid. I sank to the chipped tile floor, wrapping my arms around my knees, trembling as the reality of my entire existence shifted on its axis. My father, a man who had dedicated his life to cultivating those 500 acres of prime Story County farmland, had died without knowing the truth. He had favored Kelsey, funded her expensive college education, and praised her relentless ambition, never realizing she did not carry a single drop of his blood. The farm, the legacy, the generations of agricultural heritage he had fought to preserve, had been promised to a stranger. I sat on the bathroom floor for hours, listening to the radiator hiss and clank. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to pick up the phone, to call my mother, to demand answers and expose her lifelong hypocrisy. I wanted to drive to Kelsey's leased townhouse and shove the glowing screen in her face, forcing her to swallow the cruel birthday joke she had served me. But fear held me back. Confronting them meant detonating a bomb that would obliterate our fragile family unit forever. Once the truth was spoken aloud, there would be no turning back. The fallout would be catastrophic, messy, and public. I was terrified of being the one to light the match. I chose to remain silent. I buried the radioactive secret deep inside my chest, deciding to carry the burden rather than watch my family tear each other apart. I went back to the grocery store the next day, scanning barcodes and bagging produce with a hollow, detached rhythm. The emotional weight was suffocating. Every interaction became a grueling test of endurance. The internal conflict reached a boiling point a week later during a brief phone call with my mother. Sandra called to complain about the slow pace of the probate lawyers handling the farm estate. I stood in the break room, gripping a paper cup of lukewarm water, listening to her praise my sister. Sandra sighed dramatically into the receiver, telling me how grateful she was that Kelsey had inherited our father's business acumen. She actually used the phrase, pure family bloodline, proudly claiming that Kelsey was the only one capable of handling the impending commercial agricultural buyout. The hypocrisy burned like a physical fire in my throat. I squeezed the paper cup until the water spilled over my knuckles, biting my tongue to keep the devastating truth from spilling out of my mouth. I offered a muted, non-committal response and ended the call as quickly as possible. The toll of keeping the secret was exhausting, gnawing at my conscience every single day. I was protecting the very people who treated me like a disposable nuisance. How long could you hold on to a secret that destroys everything you thought you knew? 6 months dragged by with agonizing slowness. I kept the genetic revelation buried beneath the mundane routine of scanning barcodes and bagging groceries at the local supermarket. Every Sunday dinner became a grueling test of endurance. I sat across the dining table from my mother and sister, slicing into dry pork chops while listening to their endless discussions about the impending agricultural buyout. Our father had spent his entire life working those 500 acres of Story County farmland. He navigated land boundaries, studied crop yields, and treated the rich, dark soil with a reverence he rarely showed his own family. Now, a corporate farming conglomerate was circling the estate, finalizing the environmental assessments and boundary surveys. The proposed purchase price stretched deep into 7 figures. It was a sum that could alter a person's destiny. For me, it meant paying off crushing student loans and finally fixing the unreliable heating in my small apartment. For Kelsey, it was a golden ticket to fund her artificial high society persona. The bureaucratic gears of the probate court moved with lethargic indifference. Right up until the second week of January, I returned from a punishing closing shift at the grocery store to find a yellow slip inside my rusted metal mailbox. The local post office was holding a certified document requiring my signature. The next morning, I stood at the postal counter and received a thick envelope bearing the crisp, embossed letterhead of Henderson and Associates. Arthur Henderson was a notoriously strict estate attorney located in downtown Des Moines. He handled high-net-worth agricultural inheritances with clinical precision, possessing a reputation for strict adherence to the law and zero tolerance for family theatrics. I tore open the flap right there in the parking lot. The document was an urgent summons requiring my mandatory attendance at a beneficiary meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday. A sharp spike of anxiety hit my chest. My phone rang before I even reached my rusted sedan. The caller identification displayed my sister's name. I swiped the screen to answer, bracing for the usual condescension. Kelsey did not bother with a polite greeting. Her voice flooded the small, cold cabin of my car, dripping with profound annoyance. She complained that my required presence was nothing more than a tedious bureaucratic formality, delaying her highly anticipated payout. She lectured me about the urgency of the situation, claiming she had pending luxury real estate investments that required immediate liquid capital to secure the closing contracts. She spoke rapidly, her words betraying a hidden, frantic desperation beneath the polished arrogance. She told me to show up on time, sign whatever administrative forms the lawyer put in front of me, and avoid asking stupid questions so we could expedite the disbursement checks. I listened to her frantic instructions, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. I offered a muted agreement and ended the call, my mind churning with terrifying possibilities. Experienced probate attorneys rarely demand an urgent, mandatory meeting just to sign routine disbursement forms. The morning of the meeting delivered a brutal, quintessential Midwestern snowstorm. A heavy blanket of white covered the central Iowa landscape. turning the familiar stretches of Interstate 80 into a treacherous sheet of black ice. The wind howled across the flat plains, whipping snow across my windshield faster than my worn wiper blades could clear the glass. I navigated my aging vehicle through the hazardous conditions, my knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. The heater sputtered, blowing tepid air into the freezing cabin. The perilous drive amplified the dread twisting in my stomach. Every sliding tire and fishtailing commercial truck mirrored the unstable foundation of my own life. I was driving toward a legal reckoning, carrying a secret that felt heavier than the wet snow accumulating on the highway. I finally reached the bustling center of downtown Des Moines, parking in a concrete structure 2 blocks away from the towering glass building that housed the law firm. I trudged through the gray slush, shivering uncontrollably inside my cheap polyester winter coat. The bitter cold seeped through my thin gloves, numbing my fingers. I stepped into the sprawling, temperature-controlled lobby of Henderson and Associates, the warm air hitting my frozen cheeks. The reception area was an intimidating display of wealth, featuring polished granite floors, modern art installations, and subdued lighting. I approached the front desk, gave my name, and was directed to a plush waiting area. Kelsey was already there. She sat comfortably in a structured leather armchair, draped in a pristine designer wool coat that looked untouched by the blizzard raging outside. Her expensive leather boots rested neatly on the woven rug. She scrolled rapidly through her smartphone, her manicured thumb swiping with agitated energy. She looked up as I approached, her gaze sweeping over my damp, frayed coat and snow-covered boots. She rolled her eyes, letting out a loud sigh of exasperation, complaining that my tardiness was jeopardizing her tightly scheduled morning. I took a seat on the opposite end of the waiting area, my hands shaking so badly I had to clench them together inside my worn canvas purse. I was genuinely terrified of what the lawyer had discovered. Had the commercial buyers found a hidden lien on the property? Had my father left unrecorded debts? Or did the urgent summons have something to do with the genetic truth I had been harboring for 6 agonizing months? Before Kelsey could launch into another tirade about my lack of professionalism, a heavy wooden door clicked open. Mr. Henderson stepped into the reception area. He wore a severe dark gray suit, his posture rigid and uncompromising. He did not offer a warm greeting or polite pleasantries about the terrible weather. He simply gestured for us to follow him. He ushered us down a long, quiet corridor into an expansive corner conference room. The space smelled distinctively of old paper, Lehman furniture polish, and expensive aged leather. A sprawling mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed executive chairs. The atmosphere was incredibly dense, thick with unspoken legal threats and sterile bureaucratic power. I took a seat near the edge of the table, pulling my damp coat tightly around my shoulders. Kelsey took the seat directly across from the attorney, tossing her designer handbag onto the polished wood with a careless thud. She leaned forward, instantly launching into a demanding speech about her timeline and her expectations for the liquid funds. Mr. Henderson did not interrupt her monologue. He walked to the head of the table, carrying a single, thick manila file. The flap was secured with a red legal seal. He placed the heavy file onto the mahogany surface. The sound it made was dull but definitive, echoing sharply in the quiet room. He slowly lowered himself into his leather chair, folding his hands precisely over the sealed envelope. He ignored my presence entirely. Instead, he fixed his gaze directly onto my sister. His expression was grim, unreadable, and devoid of the deference Kelsey expected from service professionals. The intense, unyielding scrutiny of his stare functioned like a physical barrier, thoroughly stalling the rhythm of her arrogant complaints. The room grew suffocatingly still as the lawyer prepared to dismantle her reality. Mr. Henderson broke the silence by reaching forward and snapping the red legal seal on the thick manila folder. The sharp tear of the adhesive echoed in the cavernous conference room, He did not offer us coffee or engage in the polite Midwestern small talk that typically preceded business meetings in Des Moines. He drew out a stack of dense legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper and aligned them precisely on the polished mahogany surface. His demeanor was chillingly detached. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and began to explain the unyielding parameters governing our late father's estate. Our father was a man who measured worth in tangible yields. He judged the quality of a person by the calluses on their hands and the lineage in their veins. He spent his entire life expanding his Story County farm, treating the rich, dark earth as a living extension of his own legacy. To him, the 500 acres of prime corn and soybean fields were not mere commodities to be traded on the open market. They represented generations of sweat and survival. Because he viewed his land as a sacred inheritance, he approached his estate planning with the same rigid control he applied to his crops. Mr. Henderson read directly from the first page of the trust document, his voice a steady, measured baritone. Our father had established a highly restrictive testamentary trust. Deep within the legal jargon was an ironclad biological descendant clause. The clause explicitly dictated that the final liquidation of the farmland and the subsequent distribution of the multi-million-dollar proceeds could only be awarded to direct genetic heirs. Mr. Henderson explained that our father harbored a deep-seated paranoia regarding outside interference. He wanted to guarantee that his wealth remained strictly within his own bloodline, insulating his life's work from opportunistic spouses, unverified claimants, or distant relatives seeking an unearned payout. He had paid exorbitant legal fees to ensure this specific biological stipulation was legally bulletproof, weaving it into the very foundation of the probate documents. Normally, such a clause would be considered a standard bureaucratic formality, easily bypassed by birth certificates and legal assumptions of paternity. However, the situation had shifted dramatically over the past month. Mr. Henderson folded his hands over the paperwork and introduced the primary obstacle delaying our inheritance. A distant cousin from the eastern side of the state had recently stepped forward to challenge the probate proceedings. This relative had hired his own litigator, filing a formal petition arguing that he possessed a stronger legitimate claim to the agricultural legacy than we did. The cousin based his entire legal argument on ancient family grievances and unverified rumors regarding our mother's behavior 3 decades ago. This unexpected legal challenge sent shockwaves through the corporate agricultural buyers eager to acquire the property. The purchasing conglomerate, a multinational farming syndicate, operated with strict risk management protocols. They were prepared to transfer an exceptional sum of money for the Story County acreage, but they demanded a flawless transfer of ownership. They refused to proceed with the transaction if a looming legal dispute threatened the integrity of the sale. To mitigate their risk, the corporate buyers relied heavily on a specialized title insurance firm. The underwriters at the title company reviewed the cousin's petition and immediately slammed the brakes on the entire acquisition. They issued a formal mandate requiring absolute, incontrovertible genetic verification of our lineage before they would issue the title insurance policy necessary to clear the sale. Kelsey let out a loud, theatrical sigh that filled the quiet conference room. She rolled her eyes, tossing her long hair over the shoulder of her designer wool coat. She treated the attorney's meticulous explanation as a trivial inconvenience designed specifically to waste her valuable time. Her entitlement was staggering. She sat there, bathed in the confident glow of a woman who had spent her entire life receiving preferential treatment. Our father had funded her college tuition, praised her business acumen, and displayed her real estate awards on his mantle. She genuinely believed her status as the favored daughter granted her an impenetrable immunity from bureaucratic scrutiny. She leaned forward, tapping her manicured fingernails against the edge of the mahogany table. She dismissed the distant cousin as a jealous opportunist fishing for a settlement. She sharply reminded Mr. Henderson that she was a prominent figure in the local real estate market, with pending luxury investments requiring immediate liquid capital. She boasted about her professional reputation, treating the biological descendant clause as a laughable technicality. She demanded that the lawyer stop speaking in circles, expedite the paperwork, and hand over the disbursement checks so she could satisfy her impatient creditors and finalize her own property closures. Her voice carried the unmistakable edge of someone drowning in debt, but pretending to float on top of the world. Mr. Henderson did not react to her commanding tone. He simply watched her perform. When she finally paused to catch her breath, he reached into the open file and extracted a single sheet of paper. He slid the crisp document across the wide expanse of the mahogany table. It glided smoothly, coming to a halt directly in front of my sister. The room felt incredibly cold. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird striking a glass window. My lungs felt tight, and my hands shook inside the pockets of my cheap winter coat. I recognized the slow, methodical trap the attorney was laying out. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, his gaze unwavering. He explained that, in order to satisfy the title insurance underwriters, both beneficiaries had been required to submit routine medical history questionnaires, along with standard health releases. It was supposed to be a basic administrative hurdle to verify identities and clear the preliminary stages of the genetic audit. However, the insurance underwriters ran those routine medical disclosures through their verification algorithms. They cross-referenced the submitted health data with our late father's archived military and hospital records. The attorney leaned back in his leather chair, delivering the fatal blow with sterile detachment. The routine medical screening had flagged a severe, undeniable anomaly in Kelsey's file. The blood type she provided on her insurance forms was a biological impossibility when compared to the documented blood types of our mother and our late father. The underwriters detected a fundamental genetic discrepancy that could not be explained by standard inheritance patterns. The title company flagged the file as highly suspicious and immediately halted all underwriting procedures. Kelsey stared at the single sheet of paper resting in front of her. Her confident posture stiffened. The arrogant smirk vanished from her lips, replaced by a tight mask of confusion and rising defensive anger. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, refusing to even touch the document. She scoffed again, her voice pitching slightly higher as she accused the insurance underwriters of making a careless clerical error. She insisted that her medical records were flawless and that some tired intern had simply keyed the wrong data into the system. She demanded that Mr. Henderson stop wasting her morning with administrative mistakes and focus on releasing the funds she was owed. Her frustration was palpable, driven by the suffocating pressure of her hidden financial liabilities. The attorney remained motionless, entirely unaffected by her escalating demands. He looked at me for a brief, calculating moment, taking in my frayed coat and my trembling hands. Then he shifted his focus back to the woman demanding her millions. He stated in a firm, unrelenting tone that the estate funds were locked. The disbursement checks she so desperately craved were physically unprintable. The anomaly flagged by the title insurance company had elevated the distant cousin's petition from a nuisance to a credible legal threat. The corporate buyers had officially suspended the acquisition contract. Mr. Henderson folded his hands together, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. He revealed that the multi-million-dollar estate could not be distributed under any circumstances until formal, irrefutable DNA verification was officially submitted to and approved by the Polk County Probate Court. The atmosphere inside the mahogany-paneled conference room shifted instantly, the temperature plummeting as the severity of the attorney's statement settled over the heavy wooden table. The air felt brittle, charged with a sudden, suffocating tension. Mr. Henderson sat perfectly still, an immovable fixture representing the unforgiving machinery of the probate court. Kelsey stared at him, her dark eyes flashing with a potent mix of disbelief and mounting fury. She was accustomed to manipulating situations with charm and aggressive networking, skills she honed daily in the competitive Des Moines real estate market. Bureaucratic walls usually crumbled when she applied enough pressure. But the estate lawyer was not a pliable client or a desperate seller. He was the gatekeeper to millions, and he required genetic proof she assumed was a mere formality. Kelsey let out a sharp, dismissive scoff, adjusting the collar of her pristine designer coat. She refused to accept the reality of the delay, the looming threat of her creditors, the massive mortgages she had leveraged to maintain her high society facade, demanded immediate liquidity. She uncrossed her arms and aggressively snatched her latest model smartphone from the table. Her manicured fingers flew across the sleek glass screen with practiced, frantic speed. She loudly declared that the title insurance company was completely incompetent. She insisted she could resolve the entire ridiculous blood type anomaly right then and there. She boldly announced that she possessed a fully verified, comprehensive DNA profile stored securely on a commercial genetic testing database. She had submitted her sample a year ago to track inherited fitness traits, treating the complex science as a trendy lifestyle accessory. She bragged to the attorney that her digital profile contained an exhaustive breakdown of her heritage, and she was perfectly willing to forward the official PDF report directly to his secure email server to expedite the disbursement checks. I sat entirely frozen at the opposite end of the table. The cheap polyester fabric of my winter coat felt suffocatingly tight around my shoulders. My pulse pounded a frantic, deafening rhythm in my ears, drowning out the ambient hum of the office ventilation system. I knew exactly what was resting inside that commercial database. For 6 agonizing months, I had carried the devastating secret alone, terrified of the explosive collateral damage it would inflict upon our fragile family dynamic. I had stood behind the grocery store register, enduring her passive-aggressive text messages and my mother's constant favoritism, silently bearing the weight of the truth to protect the very people who treated me like a disposable nuisance. Now, Kelsey was eagerly reaching into the digital vault to pull the pin on the grenade herself. She was rushing blindly toward the execution block. Entirely convinced she was securing her crown, my hands shook violently inside my pockets. I clenched my fists, my short, unpolished nails digging painfully deep into the soft flesh of my palms, leaving sharp, crescent-shaped indentations. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to remain silent, to let her arrogance guide her straight into the catastrophic revelation. She deserved to fall. She deserved to face the consequences of the cruel joke she had weaponized against me at the Altoona diner on my birthday. But the deeply ingrained habit of protecting my family, a survival mechanism developed from years of playing the compliant scapegoat, overrode my desire for cold justice. The sheer terror of the impending explosion broke through my disciplined silence. Before my logical mind could stop the physical reaction, my voice cracked, shattering the tense quiet of the conference room. I leaned forward, my breath catching in my dry throat. I blurted out a desperate, warning command. I told her not to open the application. The words tumbled out of my mouth in a rushed, frantic plea. I begged her to put the phone down, insisting that she should not pull up the genetic profile in front of the lawyer. The sudden interruption startled Kelsey. She stopped tapping her screen and whipped her head toward me. The look she gave me was filled with pure, unfiltered venom. Her eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. Furious that the struggling cashier had dared to issue a command in a professional setting, she interpreted my warning as a pathetic, jealous attempt to sabotage her progress. She sneered, her voice dripping with extreme condescension, telling me to mind my own business and stop trying to delay the legal process with my usual paranoid anxiety. She turned her attention back to her glowing device, her thumb pressing firmly against the application icon. She completely ignored my desperate attempt to shield her from the impending trauma. I stopped breathing. The silence in the room stretched out, agonizing and thick. I watched her perfectly made-up face with the detached, morbid fascination of a bystander, observing a high-speed collision. I saw the exact millisecond her meticulously constructed reality fractured into a million jagged, irreparable pieces. The bright screen reflected in her dark pupils as the familial matching section populated. She expected to see a straightforward confirmation of her pristine agricultural lineage. Instead, her eyes scanned the top-tier genetic matches. The digital layout of the commercial portal was unforgivingly clear. She saw my name prominently listed. She saw the undeniable highlighted percentage indicating we shared a significant block of maternal DNA. Then her eyes tracked to the paternal side of the genetic ledger. She was searching for the expected links, the familiar surnames associated with our late father's expansive Story County heritage. She saw the bright, bold link connecting my profile to Helen, our father's stern paternal aunt. And then she saw her own results. She stared at the glaring, undeniable void where her paternal connection to our father's bloodline should have been. The percentage of shared DNA on the paternal side was an absolute, stark zero. There were no familiar surnames. There were no agricultural heritage markers. The database offered a cold, mathematical confirmation that she did not possess a single drop of the bloodline required to inherit the 500-acre estate. The physical reaction was instantaneous and horrifying to witness. The smartphone slipped entirely from her manicured fingers. It dropped through the empty air and hit the solid mahogany table with a loud, sharp clatter, the screen bouncing once before coming to a rest near Mr. Henderson's leather portfolio. The noise echoed harshly against the wood-paneled walls, a jarring punctuation mark to her sudden destruction. All the vibrant, confident color violently drained from Kelsey's face in less than a heartbeat. Her healthy, glowing complexion vanished, leaving her skin a sickly, ashen gray. The arrogant, untouchable real estate mogul sitting across the table ceased to exist. In her place was a terrified, hollow shell of a woman whose entire identity had just been mathematically erased by a commercial smartphone application. Her jaw fell slack, her mouth opening and closing as she desperately grasped for oxygen. She let out a sharp, ragged gasp, a terrible choking sound that conveyed a profound, existential panic. She looked wildly across the table, her wide, bloodshot eyes locking onto Mr. Henderson. She searched the attorney's stoic face for a lifeline, a legal loophole, or a simple reassurance that the screen was malfunctioning. Mr. Henderson did not flinch. He maintained his rigid, unyielding posture. He did not offer a comforting smile or a sympathetic sigh. He sat perfectly still, observing her catastrophic realization with the clinical, detached precision of a man who dealt exclusively in cold, hard facts. He was the impartial executor of a testamentary trust, and the document on the table in front of him had just become the most destructive weapon in the room. The cruel, public joke she had thrown in my face at the diner, laughing about me being another man's mistake, had boomeranged with catastrophic legal force, landing squarely on her own shoulders. What would you do if a malicious joke you played on someone instantly unraveled your entire life? The heavy silence in the conference room shattered with the explosive force of a detonating landmine. Kelsey did not gently process the devastating information glowing on her smartphone screen. The polished, professional facade she wore like a protective armor completely evaporated. She grabbed the edge of the heavy mahogany table and violently pushed herself upright. The expensive leather executive chair scraped harshly against the polished hardwood floor, emitting a sharp, ear-piercing screech that made my shoulders tense. She stood towering over the table, her chest heaving as she pulled in rapid, shallow breaths. The sheer panic rapidly mutated into raw, unadulterated rage. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly across the table at me, her dark eyes wide and wild. She screamed that the commercial databases were entirely flawed, dismissing the irrefutable genetic science as a cheap parlor trick. Her voice cracked, hitting a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed painfully off the wood-paneled walls. She wildly accused me of orchestrating an elaborate, malicious cyber attack. She yelled that I, a struggling grocery store cashier who barely understood how to update a smartphone operating system, had somehow managed to hack a multi-million-dollar encrypted biotechnology database just to frame her. She claimed I was trying to steal her rightful inheritance out of pure, bitter jealousy. The desperation in her voice was palpable. A frantic attempt to reconstruct the shattered foundation of her identity using the most absurd, illogical lies she could invent in the heat of the moment. Mr. Henderson remained remarkably composed amidst the escalating hysteria. He did not raise his voice to match her screaming. He sat back in his chair, folding his hands calmly over the sealed manila folder. He waited for her to stop yelling, allowing the deafening echo of her accusations to fade into a heavy, uncomfortable quiet. When he finally spoke, his measured baritone sliced through her chaotic denial with surgical precision. He informed her that the probate court did not accept commercial smartphone applications or erotic verbal accusations as viable legal evidence. He stated that the title insurance company required absolute certainty to release the commercial agricultural funds to satisfy the strict parameters of the testamentary trust. The court would mandate a formal, medically supervised blood test conducted by an impartial, state-approved laboratory. He explained that this stringent medical procedure was the only acceptable method to establish a legal chain of custody for the genetic material. Furthermore, he noted that securing the court order, scheduling the supervised collection, and waiting for the official laboratory analysis would significantly delay the probate proceedings. The process would take several weeks, during which the entire 500-acre estate and all associated financial assets would remain entirely locked. Kelsey stared at the attorney, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. The realization that she could not bully or charm her way past a court-ordered medical procedure finally suffocated her remaining arguments. The meeting instantly dissolved into absolute chaos. I could not endure another second in that stifling room. I grabbed my worn canvas purse, wrapping my cheap winter coat tightly around my shaking body, and bolted for the heavy wooden door. I practically sprinted down the plush, carpeted hallway of the law firm, bypassing the staring receptionist, and burst out into the freezing Iowa air. The bitter wind whipped across the gray slush of the downtown sidewalks, biting into my exposed cheeks. But I barely felt the cold. My entire body trembled with adrenaline and sheer terror. I rushed the 2 blocks to the concrete parking structure, my boots slipping on the icy pavement. I unlocked my rusty sedan, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. I locked the vehicle, turning the key in the ignition to blast the weak heater, seeking refuge inside the cold, cramped cabin of my car. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of frantic thoughts and fishtailing tires. By the time I pulled into the icy lot of my complex, my cell phone was vibrating relentlessly against the passenger seat. The screen illuminated, displaying a staggering number of missed calls and frantic text messages. The caller identification flashed my mother's name over and over again. Sandra was attempting to breach my digital boundaries with the same aggressive entitlement she used to police my behavior during Sunday dinners. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the red decline button, but the deeply ingrained obedience of a lifetime compelled me to answer. I pressed the phone to my ear, bracing myself for the inevitable onslaught. Sandra did not bother with a greeting. Her voice blasted through the small speaker, shrill and furious, entirely devoid of maternal warmth. She did not ask how the meeting went or inquire about my emotional state. She immediately launched into a vicious, full-blown verbal assault. She screamed through the receiver, furiously accusing me of sabotaging her golden child out of sheer, malicious jealousy. She claimed I had manipulated the estate attorney and poisoned the probate proceedings because I could not stand watching Kelsey succeed. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, listening to the woman who gave birth to me aggressively defend a monumental 30-year deception. I tried to speak, to inject a single shred of factual reality into her hysterical tirade. I quietly mentioned the medical anomaly flagged by the title insurance company and the undeniable results of the commercial DNA test she had encouraged at the diner. Sandra violently rejected the information. She absolutely refused to acknowledge the genetic reality. She doubled down on her delusion, employing a breathtaking level of cognitive dissonance to protect her pristine social standing within her church congregation. Admitting the truth meant confessing to infidelity, destroying the perfect Midwestern family facade she had meticulously curated for decades. She screamed that I was a liar, demanding I call the lawyer back immediately and sign whatever paperwork was necessary to release Kelsey's funds. She threatened to publicly disown me if I did not comply, weaponizing her conditional love to force my submission. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen in profound disbelief, and hit the end call button, severing the toxic connection. The psychological warfare from my mother was devastating, but the tangible legal retaliation from my sister arrived with terrifying speed. Kelsey did not retreat to mourn the loss of her biological identity. She immediately went on a ruthless, highly expensive offensive. Within 48 hours, a thick stack of legal documents was taped to the front door of my apartment by a private process server. Kelsey had retained the services of a notoriously aggressive probate litigator, a man famous for draining opposing parties through endless, expensive courtroom maneuvering. She leveraged whatever remaining credit she possessed to fund a massive legal strike. Her attorney filed an emergency injunction with the Polk County Court. The injunction formally contested the validity of the medical flag and accused me of undue influence over the estate proceedings. This aggressive legal maneuver was not designed to uncover the truth. It was a calculated siege tactic designed to bleed me dry. The judge granted the temporary injunction pending a full hearing. This action completely froze the entire trust, the multi-million-dollar agricultural payout, the funds I desperately needed to escape my grueling paycheck-to-paycheck existence, were immediately locked away inside a bureaucratic nightmare. The inheritance was trapped behind an impenetrable wall of red tape and exorbitant legal fees. The situation rapidly escalated from a private, tense family dispute into a grueling, highly public legal war. My sister and her high-priced shark of a lawyer were utilizing the slow, grinding machinery of the justice system as a weapon of attrition. They intended to bury me in frivolous motions, mandatory depositions, and endless discovery requests, fully aware that a struggling grocery store cashier could not afford to fight a protracted legal battle. The strategy was brutally simple and entirely effective. They planned to drain my meager savings, forcing me to surrender my rightful inheritance before I could even mount a proper defense. The crushing weight of the frozen assets and the impending legal bills created a massive, realistic obstacle that threatened to destroy my future completely. The reality of the probate freeze crashed down on me with devastating force, entirely severing my fragile lifeline to a secure future. I stared at the dense stack of legal injunctions taped to my apartment door, the stark black text swimming before my tired eyes. I did not possess a secret offshore account or a wealthy spouse to fund a rapid counterattack. I was a 32-year-old cashier living paycheck to paycheck in central Iowa. My bank balance rarely crested above 3 figures after rent and utilities were deducted. Retaining a high-powered attorney capable of battling Kelsey's ruthless litigator required a massive upfront retainer fee, a sum of money I simply could not manifest out of thin air. The millions of dollars I was legally entitled to inherit were locked securely behind a bureaucratic firewall, entirely inaccessible, while the emergency injunction remained active. The cruel irony of being wealthy on paper while struggling to buy groceries was a suffocating daily torment. For 3 agonizing months, I was trapped in a grueling cycle of physical and mental exhaustion. I begged my manager for every available overtime shift at the supermarket, standing on the hard rubber mats until the soles of my feet went numb. I scanned barcodes and bagged produce with a hollow, robotic rhythm, my mind constantly calculating the impending legal deadlines. While I was scrubbing the conveyor belts at midnight, Kelsey's expensive lawyer was actively burying me in an avalanche of frivolous legal motions. The mailbox outside my apartment complex became a source of profound daily terror. Every few days, a new certified envelope would arrive, packed with demanding discovery requests, complex interrogatories, and formal notices requiring my attendance at highly expensive, mandatory depositions. The legal system moved with a lethargic, indifferent pace designed to grind down individuals without resources. They demanded certified copies of documents I had to pay out of pocket to acquire. They scheduled hearings at the exact times I was supposed to be clocking into work, forcing me to sacrifice my hourly wage just to sit in a cold courthouse hallway while the attorneys requested further continuances. The constant, relentless stress began to physically manifest. I lost weight. My sleep was broken by anxious night sweats, and my hands developed a permanent, slight tremor. One particular Tuesday afternoon, the immense pressure finally shattered my practiced composure. I was sitting in the cramped, windowless employee break room at the grocery store, staring at a lukewarm cup of instant coffee. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed loudly above the stained linoleum table. I pulled a new legal notice from my purse. A formal demand to cover the transcription costs of an upcoming deposition. The total printed at the bottom of the page exceeded my entire monthly rent. The sheer impossibility of the demand struck me like a physical blow. I dropped the paper onto the table and buried my face in my hands. I did not deliver a stoic, cinematic monologue. I broke down and cried out of pure, unadulterated frustration. Hot, angry tears soaked my palms as the overwhelming reality of the situation crushed my chest. It felt like a rigged game where the wealthy always possessed the power to crush the working class, actively using the complex machinery of the justice system as a weapon to suppress the truth. I felt entirely powerless against the massive financial disparity separating me from my sister. Desperation forced me to seek alternatives. I attempted to navigate the complex legal battlefield entirely on my own, determined to represent myself pro se. After finishing my exhausting 10-hour shifts, I drove my unreliable sedan to the downtown public library. I spent my nights huddled in a quiet corner, poring over heavy, dust-covered volumes of Iowa inheritance statutes and probate case law. I drank cheap vending machine coffee to stay awake, my eyes burning as I tried to decipher the archaic legal terminology. I drafted messy, handwritten responses to the aggressive motions filed by Kelsey's lawyer, desperately hoping the judge would recognize the earnest truth hidden beneath my lack of formal legal training. However, the bureaucratic red tape proved to be an impenetrable fortress. My filings were consistently rejected by the court clerks due to minor formatting errors or improper citation structures. The legal system was not designed to accommodate earnest individuals seeking justice. It was a rigid, highly structured arena built exclusively for professionals. While I was drowning in legal textbooks and struggling to afford basic necessities, Kelsey launched a highly visible psychological offensive. She utilized whatever remaining credit she possessed to project a flawless image of absolute victory. Her social media feeds were a curated stream of perceived success, featuring photos of her dining at upscale restaurants and attending exclusive real estate networking events. She actively leveraged her pristine online persona to control the narrative among our extended family and her church community, painting me as a bitter, unstable sister attempting to steal her rightful legacy. Her intimidation tactics extended beyond the digital realm. She began driving her leased, spotless white luxury SUV slowly past my modest apartment complex. I would stand by my thin living room curtains, watching her idle near the dumpsters. A blatant, silent warning that she was monitoring my every move. The stark disparity in our resources was a brutal, incredibly realistic obstacle that could not be solved with a quick, witty comeback or a sudden burst of confidence. The psychological warfare was designed to isolate me, to make me feel entirely surrounded and outmatched. The relentless assault pushed me to the absolute brink of surrender. I sat on my worn, second-hand sofa, staring at the growing stack of rejected legal filings and unpaid bills. The exhaustion seeped into my bones, a heavy, paralyzing weight. I deeply questioned if the inheritance was even worth the severe psychological torture my family was actively inflicting upon me. The idea of simply signing the settlement waiver, surrendering half the estate just to make the relentless legal harassment stop, became an incredibly seductive thought. I wanted peace more than I wanted the millions locked in the trust. I wanted to sever the toxic connection to my mother and sister entirely, even if it meant walking away empty-handed. The internal conflict tore at my conscience, presenting a choice between securing my financial future and preserving my rapidly deteriorating mental health. The overwhelming desire to concede was strong, but the surrender would validate 3 decades of deception. The breaking point arrived on a damp, gray Thursday evening. I was sitting on my faded apartment rug, surrounded by scattered Iowa probate statutes and half-written legal responses. The exhaustion was a physical ache in my joints. A sharp, frantic knocking at my front door shattered the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I did not expect any visitors. I stood up, my muscles stiff, and peered through the scratched peephole. Standing in the poorly lit hallway was my mother. Sandra did not look like the composed, judgmental woman who organized Sunday school bake sales and dictated neighborhood gossip. The pristine church lady facade had completely fractured under the immense, crushing pressure of her impending social ruin. Her usually immaculate hair was disheveled, damp from the light drizzle outside. She wore a wrinkled beige trench coat hastily thrown over a simple blouse, entirely lacking her signature pearl necklace and coordinated accessories. Her face was pale, drawn, and deeply lined with an exhaustion that mirrored my own. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the deadbolt. The deeply ingrained instinct to protect myself warred against the lifelong conditioning to answer my mother's call. With a heavy sigh, I turned the lock and opened the door. Sandra pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, bringing the smell of wet wool and stale desperation into my small living space. She did not comment on the cheap furniture or the stacks of legal paperwork covering the floor. She practically collapsed onto my sagging sofa, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook violently as a loud, guttural sob ripped through the quiet apartment. It was a raw, unfiltered sound I had never heard her make. My mother was a woman who prided herself on absolute emotional control, always maintaining a perfect Midwestern stoicism. Watching her break down so completely was profoundly jarring. I stood near the kitchen counter, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, maintaining a safe physical distance. I did not offer a comforting hug or a glass of water. I waited for the performance to end, expecting another round of gaslighting or a renewed demand for my submission. But the tears were genuine. The terror radiating from her was unmistakable. She looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and swimming with mascara. The confession spilled from her lips in a frantic, disjointed rush. She admitted the truth, finally tearing down the 30-year deception that had shaped our lives. Her voice trembled as she recounted a brief, reckless affair that occurred 3 decades ago during the annual Ragbri bicycle ride across the state. Our father had been away on a massive agricultural equipment purchasing trip, leaving her feeling isolated and overwhelmed by the demands of managing the farm household. She sought solace in a fleeting connection that resulted in Kelsey's conception. She confessed to the suffocating terror she felt when she realized the truth, terrified of our father's stern, unyielding judgment. To protect her marriage and her social standing, she buried the secret, projecting her guilt onto me while overcompensating by showering Kelsey with unearned affection. The admission hung in the stale air of my apartment, heavy and toxic. She did not offer a profound apology for the years of emotional neglect I suffered. Her confession was driven entirely by self-preservation. She leaned forward, reaching across the cheap coffee table, her hands grasping desperately for mine. Her grip was tight and frantic. She pleaded with me to formally reject the commercial DNA results, begging me to withdraw my legal opposition and sign a binding settlement agreement granting Kelsey half the agricultural estate. "Please, Ashley," Sandra sobbed, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation. Don't ruin our family over a technicality. The community will never look at us the same way if this goes to trial. The gossip will destroy me. Your father loved her. Regardless of biology. Just sign the papers so we can put this nightmare behind us. The sheer audacity of her request hit me with the force of a physical blow. She dared to call the biological descendant clause, the very foundation of our father's legacy, a mere technicality. She was actively asking me to surrender millions of dollars and validate a lifelong lie simply to protect her fragile reputation from the judgment of her church congregation. I did not react with the stoic, cinematic coldness I always imagined I would possess in this moment. The carefully constructed armor I had built over the last few months shattered completely. I violently yanked my hands out of her grasp, stumbling backward until my spine hit the edge of the kitchen counter. My vision blurred as hot. Furious tears flooded my eyes. The suppressed pain of an entire lifetime erupted messily into the open. I yelled at her, my voice raw and cracking. I did not deliver perfect, rehearsed sentences. I stumbled over my words, hyperventilating as the anger poured out of me. I demanded to know why my entire existence was treated as a disposable burden, why I was forced to endure endless criticism and neglect while she aggressively protected the golden child. I screamed, asking how she could sit in that diner and watch Kelsey humiliate me with a DNA kit, knowing full well the devastating secret she harbored. The agonizing injustice of it all burned my throat. Why was my suffering considered an acceptable baseline for our family? But Kelsey facing the consequences of the truth was suddenly framed as an unbearable tragedy. Sandra recoiled from my outburst. But she did not retreat. She doubled down, using every ounce of maternal manipulation she possessed. She wept louder, sinking to her knees on the faded rug, clinging to the fabric of my jeans. She begged for mercy, shifting the narrative to paint herself as a desperate mother trying to save her daughters from tearing each other apart. She weaponized her vulnerability, crying that she was an old woman who could not survive the public shame of a probate trial exposing her infidelity. The psychological onslaught was incredibly effective. Despite the blazing anger in my chest, a deeply ingrained sense of daughterly obligation flared to life. The sight of my mother kneeling on my floor, shattered and begging, triggered a profound, agonizing internal conflict. The conditioning of a lifetime told me to surrender, to absorb the pain to keep the peace. The urge to simply sign the settlement, forfeit the money, and end the relentless emotional turmoil was a powerful, seductive siren call. I stood in my cramped apartment, my breathing ragged, severely torn between securing the future I deserved and destroying the only family structure I had ever known. Have you ever felt a crushing wave of guilt simply for setting a necessary boundary with a toxic parent? The turbulent aftermath of my mother's confession left me hollow, drifting through my grocery store shifts in a haze of emotional exhaustion. The chaotic scene in my apartment played on a continuous loop in my mind, amplifying the guilt that threatened to unravel my resolve. 2 days later, a brutal winter evening settled over central Iowa, plunging the temperature well below freezing. I clocked out after another grueling double shift, my uniform smelling strongly of bleached cardboard and fatigue. The parking lot was a desolate expanse of gray slush and dim, flickering security lights. Mostly empty, save for a few employee vehicles huddled against the biting wind. I pulled my thin coat tight across my chest, digging into my worn canvas purse for my keys as I approached my rusted sedan. I stopped short, my breath catching in a visible plume of white vapor. A figure leaned against the driver's side door of my car, arms crossed tightly against the cold. Instinct urged me to turn back toward the safety of the brightly lit store, anticipating another round of vicious legal threats or manipulative screaming. But as I drew closer, the aggressive posture I expected was notably absent. It was Kelsey, but she looked entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant real estate mogul who had mocked me at the Altoona diner. The polished, designer armor she usually wore to project an image of absolute dominance was gone. She was dressed in baggy, faded sweatpants and a bulky, oversized parka that swallowed her frame, making her look incredibly small against the harsh industrial backdrop of the loading docks. Her face was pale, devoid of the meticulous makeup that typically served as her mask of superiority. Dark, bruised circles shadowed her eyes, mirroring the profound exhaustion I felt in my own bones. She shivered visibly in the frigid wind. Her shoulders slumped in an attitude of total defeat. This was not the hostile litigator preparing to bury me in frivolous motions. This was a broken woman waiting in the freezing dark. I stopped a few feet away, my keys clutched defensively in my gloved hand. I did not speak, wary of a hidden trap. For the first time in our lives, the silence stretching between us lacked its usual venomous edge. Kelsey looked down at the icy asphalt, avoiding my gaze, her breath shuddering as she struggled to find her voice. When she finally spoke, the harsh, commanding tone that defined her personality was entirely missing. Her voice was barely a whisper, fragile and stripped of all pretense, carrying a genuine, raw sorrow that caught me completely off guard. She did not launch into a tirade defending her legal right to the estate. She did not scream about her shattered identity or blame me for the genetic reality. Instead, she confessed the profound, suffocating truth hiding beneath her carefully curated high society facade. The confession spilled out in ragged sentences, revealing the crushing weight of the expectations that had shaped her entire existence. She admitted that her luxury real estate business, the cornerstone of her perceived success, was a hollow shell collapsing under a mountain of insurmountable debt. "Dad demanded absolute perfection from me," Kelsey whispered, a single tear escaping to freeze on her cheek. "He pushed me so incredibly hard to be the successful one, to be the glowing representation of his legacy. I have been drowning in commercial debt for years, leveraging every single credit line just to maintain the illusion, just trying to make him proud of me. I bought houses I could not afford and leased cars to look the part because he expected a winner. If I lose this inheritance, Ashley, I lose my house, my business, my entire life. The banks will foreclose on everything before the end of the month." In that brief, quiet moment under the flickering parking lot lights, the monstrous image I held of my sister began to fracture. The arrogant bully who had weaponized a DNA test to humiliate me suddenly dissolved, revealing the terrified, deeply flawed woman underneath. She was not a pure, calculating villain, orchestrating my misery for sport. She was a product of the same rigid, unforgiving agricultural patriarch who had alienated me. Our father had pitted us against each other, rewarding her superficial compliance while punishing my inability to fit his mold. He had demanded a specific performance, and Kelsey had mortgaged her entire soul to deliver it. She had built her entire identity on the false premise of a bloodline she did not actually possess, driven by a desperate need for our father's validation. The sheer magnitude of her impending financial ruin was staggering. She was staring into the abyss of total bankruptcy, about to lose the only identity she had ever known. The cruel facade she maintained was a defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to shield her fragile reality from the harsh judgment of the world. A painful, unexpected tug of empathy constricted my chest. It was a deeply confusing emotion, warring violently with the years of resentment I harbored. The clear-cut narrative of righteous justice I had clung to during my late-night legal research suddenly became incredibly murky. The choice before me was no longer a simple legal victory. It was a profound moral dilemma. If I proceeded with the probate challenge, insisting on the strict execution of the biological descendant clause, I would secure my financial freedom, escaping the grueling cycle of minimum wage shifts. But the cost of my liberation would be the absolute, undeniable destruction of my sister's life. The internal conflict was agonizing. Could I truly build a peaceful, secure future on the ashes of her ruin? I stared at Kelsey, shivering in her oversized parka, the weight of the decision pressing down on my shoulders like a physical burden, the desire to show mercy, to save the sister who had tortured me, fought desperately against the fierce instinct for self-preservation. I stood in the freezing Iowa parking lot, entirely unsure if the multi-million-dollar inheritance was worth the agonizing moral price tag attached to it. Should I surrender the wealth to protect the shattered remnants of my family? Or hold the line and claim the legacy that was rightfully mine? The piercing chill of the grocery store parking lot lingered in my bones long after I drove away from Kelsey's tearful confession. The quiet drive back to my cramped apartment was filled with a suffocating, heavy silence. The image of my sister, stripped of her aggressive armor and shivering in oversized sweatpants, gnawed at my conscience. The raw vulnerability she displayed had nearly breached the defensive walls I spent my entire life constructing. The urge to simply sign the waiver, to absorb the financial loss in order to protect her from the catastrophic collapse of her fabricated reality, was a deeply seductive siren song. However, as I sat alone on my faded sofa, staring at the stacks of unpaid utility bills, a sharp, cold clarity pierced through the emotional fog. Surrendering my rightful inheritance would not magically heal the broken foundation of our family. It would merely reinforce the toxic dynamic that had marginalized me for 3 decades. It would validate the premise that my needs, my future, and my very identity were disposable commodities, easily sacrificed to maintain the pristine illusion of the golden child. I refused to remain the perennial sacrificial lamb to a 30-year-old lie. The empathy I felt was genuine, but it could not supersede my fundamental right to survive. The decision to fight cemented my resolve, transforming my frantic anxiety into a calculated, desperate pursuit of competent legal representation. My previous attempts to navigate the labyrinthine probate system, pro se, had resulted in nothing but rejected filings and mounting frustration. I needed an advocate who understood the brutal machinery of the court, but my bank account balance remained a glaring obstacle. High-powered litigators demanded astronomical retainer fees, forcing me to canvass the lesser-known, grittier legal practices clustered in the older commercial districts of Des Moines. After numerous rejections from attorneys who deemed the case too convoluted or financially risky without upfront payment, I finally secured a consultation with Sarah. Sarah was a tough, pragmatic probate attorney operating out of a modest, no-frills office above a bustling downtown bakery. She did not wear designer suits or project an aura of intimidating wealth. She was a sharp, focused woman who favored practical blazers and kept a messy desk overflowing with color-coded case files. Her reputation in the local legal community was built on a fierce, uncompromising dedication to untangling complex inheritance disputes, often advocating for clients who lacked the resources to fight legacy wealth. I sat across from her cluttered desk, my hands gripping my worn purse, and laid out the entire chaotic narrative. I presented the timeline of events, the urgent summons from Mr. Henderson, the flagged title insurance anomaly, and the explosive results of the commercial genetic testing kit. I did not sugarcoat the family dynamics or attempt to hide the viciousness of Kelsey's legal retaliation. Sarah listened with intense, quiet focus, her pen scratching rapid notes on a yellow legal pad. She did not offer hollow sympathy or false promises of an easy victory. Instead, she evaluated the evidence with the clinical detachment of a seasoned strategist. After reviewing the meticulous documentation, Sarah leaned back in her chair and delivered a lifeline. She agreed to accept my case on a contingency fee basis. The arrangement meant she would only receive payment if we successfully secured the inheritance, assuming a significant financial risk on her part. She explained that our defense would center on a highly specific, rigid Iowa inheritance statute governing the precise legal definitions of biological descent and the implications of genealogical fraud within a testamentary trust. The strategy we developed was a stark departure from the emotional warfare my mother and sister employed. Sarah insisted we strip away the dramatic family history and focus exclusively on incontrovertible, empirical data. We would not engage in screaming matches or public character assassinations. We would build a rigorous, undeniable defense, utilizing cold, hard medical facts. However, the legal maneuver required an immense, excruciating degree of patience. The probate judge, refusing to base a multi-million-dollar ruling on a consumer-grade smartphone application, issued a formal mandate. The court ordered both Kelsey and me to submit to official, medically supervised genetic testing conducted by an impartial, state-approved clinical laboratory. Establishing the strict legal chain of custody for the biological samples would delay the proceedings for another grueling 6 weeks. The waiting period was a profound psychological marathon. The injunction keeping the estate funds frozen remained active, forcing me to continue working exhausting double shifts at the grocery store just to cover my basic living expenses. My mother escalated her campaign of emotional manipulation, leaving a relentless barrage of tearful, frantic voicemails on my phone. Sandra pleaded with me to drop the case, alternating between begging for mercy and furiously accusing me of destroying the family reputation. I maintained a strict, agonizing silence, refusing to return her calls or engage with her escalating hysteria. The discipline required to ignore her pleas felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. A daily battle between my programmed obedience and my newfound determination to secure my future. As the date of the official medical results approached, Sarah summoned me to her office to prepare for the inevitable legal combat. She warned me that Kelsey's high-priced litigator would not quietly accept the genetic truth. The opposing counsel was preparing to launch a brutal, aggressive deposition, attempting to circumvent the medical data by attacking my credibility. Sarah explained that their strategy would rely heavily on painting me as an opportunistic, unstable manipulator who had somehow orchestrated the entire crisis to steal her sister's rightful legacy. The preparation for the deposition was an exhausting, deeply traumatic process. We spent hours in a cramped conference room, role-playing the hostile interrogation I was about to endure. Sarah forced me to confront every cruel insult, every passive-aggressive slight, and every moment of profound alienation my family had ever inflicted upon me. We meticulously translated my lifelong emotional trauma into sterile, objective legal exhibits. I had to practice maintaining a calm, unyielding composure while Sarah hurled simulated accusations at me, training me to deflect the verbal attacks without showing a single ounce of emotional vulnerability. The process felt like repeatedly tearing open a barely healed wound. A brutal, necessary exercise to forge the impenetrable armor I would need to survive the impending legal onslaught. The clinical documentation of my painful history was a stark reminder that justice in the courtroom rarely resembles the swift, satisfying resolutions found in cinematic dramas. It is an ugly, grueling trench war, and I was stepping directly onto the front lines. The morning of the deposition arrived with a suffocating, heavy humidity that promised an afternoon thunderstorm. I navigated my unreliable sedan through the congested downtown traffic, my stomach churning with a potent mixture of dread and stale coffee. I pulled into the parking garage adjacent to the gleaming glass high-rise that housed the opposing counsel's law firm. The building was an imposing monument to corporate wealth, a stark, intimidating contrast to Sarah's modest office above the bakery. I smoothed the wrinkles from my simple, tailored blazer, a garment I had purchased from a thrift store specifically for this occasion, and took a long, unsteady breath before stepping into the elevator. The environment was designed to intimidate. The deposition did not take place in a grand, cinematic courtroom filled with spectators. It occurred in a cramped, stuffy interior conference room buried deep within the labyrinthine layout of the law firm. The space lacked windows, illuminated only by harsh, buzzing fluorescent panels that cast unflattering shadows across the polished veneer table. The air was stagnant, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and anxious sweat. A court stenographer sat quietly in the corner, her fingers hovering over a specialized keyboard, ready to permanently record every syllable spoken during the grueling interrogation. Kelsey was already seated when I entered, flanked by her formidable legal team. She wore a severe, dark pantsuit, her posture rigid and defensive. The vulnerable, terrified woman I had encountered in the freezing grocery store parking lot was entirely gone. She had retreated behind her polished, aggressive armor, her eyes refusing to meet mine as I took the seat opposite her. Beside her sat Mr. Davis, a notorious probate litigator whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him. He was an older man with sharp, predatory eyes and a tailored suit that projected absolute authority. He did not offer a polite greeting or engage in introductory small talk. He simply unclasped his heavy leather briefcase and arranged a thick stack of documents on the table with deliberate, intimidating precision. Sarah sat beside me, her presence a quiet, grounding anchor amidst the escalating tension. She placed a single, neat folder in front of her, offering me a brief, reassuring nod before the recording officially commenced. The moment the stenographer indicated she was ready, Mr. Davis launched his assault. He did not ask gentle, probing questions. He deployed a relentless, rapid-fire interrogation technique designed specifically to confuse, disorient, and break the composure of his target. His voice was a booming, aggressive baritone that filled the small, suffocating room. He immediately attacked my financial stability, demanding detailed, invasive explanations regarding my modest income and my lack of significant assets. He peppered me with questions about my outstanding student loans, my credit card debt, and my hourly wage at the supermarket. His strategy was blatantly transparent. He intended to paint a portrait of a desperate, impoverished woman who harbored a deep-seated, vindictive jealousy toward her highly successful sister. He aggressively framed the commercial DNA testing kit not as an unfortunate birthday present, but as a calculated, premeditated scheme I had orchestrated to manipulate the probate proceedings and steal Kelsey's rightful inheritance. The pressure in the room was immense. I did not deliver the sharp, flawless comebacks I had practiced with Sarah. The reality of sitting under the glaring lights, facing a hostile attorney intent on destroying my character, eroded my prepared defenses. My palms sweat profusely, sticking to the smooth surface of the table. I stuttered during several responses, my voice betraying a noticeable tremor as Mr. Davis skillfully twisted my words, taking innocuous statements out of context to fit his malicious narrative. He interrupted my explanations, talking over me with calculated aggression, refusing to allow me the space to articulate the complex family dynamics that preceded the genetic revelation. The interrogation ground on for hours, a relentless psychological beating that chipped away at my resolve. The breaking point arrived when Mr. Davis leaned across the table, his eyes narrowing with a look of profound disgust. He explicitly implied that I was an unstable, greedy opportunist who was actively exploiting a grieving family to fund a lifestyle I was too lazy to earn myself. He sneered the word cashier as if it were a contagious disease, a direct, deliberate insult to the years of exhausting labor I had endured while my sister enjoyed the financial padding of our father's approval. The searing humiliation snapped the final thread of my disciplined silence. I lost my temper completely. I did not execute a calm, strategic pivot. I slammed my open palm violently against the polished table, the sharp, echoing crack startling the stenographer. I leaned forward, my voice rising to a frantic, cracking shout. I yelled across the room, pointing a shaking finger directly at my sister. I screamed that I did not buy the genetic kit. I shouted that Kelsey had purchased the test herself, wrapping it in bright paper and handing it to me in a crowded diner as a cruel, public joke about my appearance. My outburst was sloppy, loud, and entirely driven by raw, unedited emotion. The sudden explosion of anger drew a sharp, formal reprimand from the stenographer, who struggled to capture the chaotic, overlapping dialogue. Kelsey flinched, her rigid posture faltering for a fraction of a second as the undeniable truth of the birthday dinner was entered into the official record. Mr. Davis immediately capitalized on my emotional display. attempting to frame the outburst as definitive proof of my supposed instability. He opened his mouth to launch another volley of aggressive accusations, but Sarah swiftly and decisively intervened. She did not engage in the shouting match. She raised a single, authoritative hand, her calm, measured tone slicing through the chaotic energy in the room. Sarah expertly redirected the focus of the deposition away from the messy, emotional history and back to the incontrovertible, empirical data. She addressed Mr. Davis directly, reminding him that regardless of the interpersonal conflicts or the origins of the commercial testing kit, the legal reality of the probate case remained unchanged. She clearly articulated that the strict phrasing of the biological descendant clause embedded within the testamentary trust was not subject to emotional interpretation or character assessments. The impending court-ordered, medically supervised blood tests would provide absolute, undeniable proof of lineage. Sarah stated firmly that no amount of aggressive litigation or character assassination could alter a fundamental genetic fact. The reminder of the impending medical reality landed heavily in the stuffy conference room. Kelsey sat silently across the table, watching her expensive lawyer attempt to salvage his strategy. He continued his interrogation for another hour, but the aggressive momentum had been entirely derailed by Sarah's unwavering focus on the medical facts. The legal maneuvering could delay the inevitable, but it could not argue away the fundamental biological truth. When the grueling 4-hour deposition finally concluded, the stenographer packed her equipment, and the heavy tension in the room began to slowly dissipate. I stood up on trembling legs, my entire body aching with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The intense psychological warfare had drained every ounce of my energy. I walked out of the imposing glass building and into the humid, stormy afternoon air, feeling remarkably fragile. The brutal interrogation served as a stark, sobering reminder that fighting for justice in the real world is an incredibly ugly, stressful endeavor. It rarely resembles a glamorous, cinematic victory filled with soaring music and flawless speeches. It is a grinding, exhausting war of attrition. And I had just survived my first major battle. The immediate legal hurdle was cleared. But the financial strain the delay tactics placed on my sister's life was about to trigger a catastrophic, highly visible collapse. The punishing summer heat settled over central Iowa, baking the asphalt parking lot of the grocery store where I continued to clock my daily shifts. Inside the air-conditioned building, the rhythmic beep of the barcode scanner offered a bizarrely comforting routine amidst the legal chaos consuming my family. Following the brutal deposition, the probate judge officially took our case under advisement. The court mandated the formal, medically supervised genetic testing, a rigid process that introduced another agonizing delay into the proceedings. The agricultural buyers, unwilling to wait indefinitely for the title dispute to resolve, granted a final, unyielding extension on the commercial buyout contract. The multi-million-dollar estate remained entirely frozen, locked securely behind a wall of judicial red tape. This bureaucratic purgatory, initially orchestrated by Kelsey's aggressive litigator as a weapon of attrition, began to violently backfire on her own carefully constructed existence. My sister had built her entire identity and her supposedly thriving business on the anticipation of an immediate, massive cash infusion from our father's legacy. She operated in the high-stakes, highly competitive Des Moines luxury real estate market, an industry that demands constant, visible liquidity. Agents must project an aura of effortless wealth to attract affluent clients, funding expensive marketing campaigns, hosting lavish open houses, and maintaining a pristine, opulent personal image. Kelsey had financed this entire charade, utilizing exorbitant lines of revolving credit, confident that the impending agricultural payout would effortlessly wipe the slate clean before the interest compounded. With the trust assets inaccessible and the legal fees mounting daily, her fragile financial ecosystem rapidly destabilized. The creditors, entirely unsympathetic to pending probate disputes, simply ran out of patience. I observed the unraveling of her heavily curated life from a quiet, detached distance. The initial cracks appeared on her normally pristine social media feeds. The stream of staged photographs featuring expensive dinners and designer coffee cups abruptly ceased. The glamorous, fast-paced narrative was replaced by a glaring, unnatural silence, a desperate attempt to hide the impending disaster from her professional peers and our mother's judgmental church circle. The digital silence quickly manifested into stark, undeniable physical reality. A former high school classmate who worked at a local towing company discreetly mentioned witnessing an event that confirmed my suspicions. Early one Tuesday morning, long before the suburban neighborhood stirred, a flatbed tow truck arrived outside Kelsey's heavily mortgaged townhouse. The driver swiftly hooked up the pristine white luxury SUV she had proudly paraded past my apartment months prior. The repossession was executed quietly and efficiently, removing the most visible symbol of her artificial success before the morning commute began. She was stripped of her primary status symbol, forced to rely on expensive rideshare services or borrow a vehicle to navigate her sprawling territory. The loss of the vehicle triggered a catastrophic domino effect within her professional life. The real estate business requires significant capital to market luxury properties effectively. Without access to her frozen credit lines, Kelsey could no longer afford the professional photography, the glossy printed brochures, or the expensive staging furniture necessary to sell high-end homes. As her marketing efforts stalled, several of her prominent, wealthy clients grew impatient with the lack of progress. They abruptly severed their contracts, transferring their lucrative listings to rival agents who possessed the resources to close the deals. Her professional reputation, built entirely on projecting flawless capability, sustained massive, irreparable damage. The crushing debt she had tearfully confessed to me during that freezing encounter in the grocery store parking lot was no longer a hidden, shameful secret. It had mutated into a suffocating, highly public reality. My mother, witnessing the rapid destruction of her golden child's empire, panicked. Sandra abandoned her usual posture of aloof moral superiority and scrambled desperately to intervene. She recognized that Kelsey's financial ruin directly threatened the pristine social image she had meticulously maintained within her congregation. Sandra attempted to secure substantial personal loans from local banks, intending to bail Kelsey out of her immediate arrears. However, the financial institutions operated on cold, hard data, entirely impervious to my mother's frantic, emotional appeals. Sandra's own financial profile was heavily reliant on the anticipated inheritance. Without the guaranteed equity from the Story County farm, her debt-to-income ratio proved insufficient. The loan officers politely but firmly declined her applications, citing her lack of tangible collateral, while the estate remained frozen in litigation. Sandra's inability to leverage the family legacy to rescue Kelsey exposed the fundamental vulnerability of their shared delusion. They had both operated under the arrogant assumption that the wealth belonged entirely to them, treating the biological descendant clause as a trivial technicality rather than a rigid legal boundary. The financial ruin they were currently experiencing was not the result of a malicious, calculated sabotage on my part. I had not frozen her bank accounts, contacted her creditors, or orchestrated the repossession of her vehicle. The devastation was simply the natural, inevitable consequence of living drastically beyond their means while relying on a stolen heritage. They had built a fragile, towering structure on a foundation of lies, and the weight of that deception was finally causing the entire edifice to collapse inward. I observed their panic from a position of unexpected, quiet strength. I did not engage in gloating or attempt to rub my impending victory in their faces. I simply continued clocking into my shifts at the supermarket, finding a strange, profound grounding comfort in my honest, blue-collar labor, the grueling physical work, the predictable rhythm of scanning items, and the straightforward exchange of wages for hours served as a powerful anchor during the chaotic legal storm. I lived strictly within my modest means, budgeting my meager income to cover my basic expenses, while Sarah navigated the complex probate system on a contingency basis. The stark contrast between our lives became increasingly apparent. While their artificial, high society world burned down completely, consumed by the demands of relentless creditors and public humiliation, my simple, authentic life remained intact. I did not owe thousands of dollars to luxury car dealerships or high-end marketing firms. I was not terrified of answering my phone, fearing a collection agency demanding payment. The intense, suffocating pressure they experienced was entirely self-inflicted, a direct result of prioritizing appearance over reality. The financial squeeze placed immense, crushing strain on the relationship between my mother and sister. The united front they had presented during the hostile deposition fractured rapidly under the weight of impending bankruptcy. Sandra began leaving me frantic, tearful voicemails, her tone alternating between desperate pleading and vicious accusations. She blamed me for tearing the family apart, demanding that I withdraw my claim and sign the settlement waiver to save Kelsey from total ruin. She attempted to weaponize my lifelong desire for her approval, promising that our relationship could be repaired if I simply surrendered the inheritance. I listened to the messages in the quiet solitude of my apartment, feeling a twinge of residual sadness for the family dynamic I had always craved but never truly possessed. The temptation to concede, to extinguish the blazing conflict by giving them exactly what they demanded, was a powerful, lingering echo of my past conditioning. However, the clarity I gained during the brutal deposition held firm. Surrendering the funds would not heal our family. It would merely reinforce the toxic cycle of exploitation and deceit. It would validate the premise that my future was a disposable asset, meant to be sacrificed whenever Kelsey required a bailout. I deleted the voicemails without responding. I chose to maintain my strict, agonizing silence, refusing to participate in their emotional theater. The legal process was nearing its final conclusion. The court-mandated medical tests had been completed, the sterile vials of blood securing the undeniable, empirical truth. We were merely waiting for the bureaucratic machinery to process the results and schedule the final hearing. The agonizing waiting period was drawing to a close, and the definitive ruling that would permanently alter the trajectory of our lives was imminent. The impending judgment would finally sever the tangled web of lies, delivering a verdict that no amount of expensive litigation or maternal manipulation could possibly overturn. 9 exhausting months dragged by after the initial summons in Mr. Henderson's office. An eternity spent navigating a labyrinth of bureaucratic delays and aggressive legal maneuvering. The brutal Iowa winter thawed into a humid, oppressive summer, mirroring the stifling tension that gripped my life. Finally, the protracted legal battle reached its inevitable climax. We were summoned to the Polk County Courthouse, located in the heart of Des Moines, for the judge's final ruling regarding the contested agricultural estate. I navigated the heavy downtown traffic, my hands gripping the steering wheel of my unreliable sedan, feeling a profound, bone-deep exhaustion rather than anticipation. The relentless pressure of the frozen assets, the grueling double shifts at the grocery store, and the constant, suffocating anxiety of the impending verdict had drained every ounce of my energy. I walked through the imposing metal detectors at the courthouse entrance, my cheap blazer feeling stiff and uncomfortable in the formal environment. The wide corridors bustled with attorneys rushing between hearings, their hurried conversations echoing off the polished stone walls. I located the assigned courtroom and pushed open the heavy wooden double doors. The space smelled distinctively of industrial floor wax, aged leather, and old paper, a sterile, institutional scent that offered no comfort. The courtroom was devoid of a jury box or a dramatic gallery filled with eager spectators. It was a purely administrative setting designed for the cold, efficient processing of probate disputes. Sarah was already seated at the plaintiff's table, her practical briefcase open. Organizing a small stack of meticulously tabbed files, she offered a brief, reassuring nod as I took the wooden chair beside her, The atmosphere was remarkably quiet, lacking the volatile energy that defined our earlier deposition. Across the aisle sat Kelsey, flanked by Mr. Davis, her expensive, notoriously aggressive litigator. The transformation in my sister was stark and undeniable. The arrogant, polished real estate mogul who had confidently mocked my appearance at the Altoona diner was entirely gone. Kelsey looked physically diminished. Her posture slumped. Wearing a subdued, neutral suit that lacked her usual designer flair. The crushing weight of her recent vehicle repossession and the very public collapse of her business had visibly eroded her confident facade. My mother, Sandra, sat rigidly in the small spectator area directly behind the defense table. She clutched a worn leather handbag against her chest, her knuckles stark white, staring straight ahead with wide, terrified eyes. The pristine, judgmental church lady persona had fractured completely. She was sitting in a public courtroom, moments away from a ruling that would permanently expose the 30-year deception she had desperately tried to bury. The severe social ruin she feared more than anything else was about to become a matter of official public record. The heavy wooden door located behind the bench swung open, and the bailiff instructed the room to rise. The Honorable Judge Collins took her seat, adjusting her reading glasses before opening the thick manila file resting on her desk. Judge Collins possessed a reputation throughout Polk County as a pragmatic, fiercely intelligent jurist who possessed zero tolerance for emotional theatrics or frivolous legal delays. She operated with strict adherence to statutory law, refusing to be swayed by dramatic family narratives or aggressive lawyering. She did not waste time with introductory pleasantries or sweeping opening statements. She immediately addressed the core issue impeding the distribution of the estate. Judge Collins formally entered the results of the court-ordered, medically supervised genetic testing into the official record. The sterile, unyielding medical data replaced the chaotic screaming matches and the commercial smartphone applications that had initially ignited the conflict. The judge spoke with absolute, clinical precision, her voice echoing clearly across the quiet courtroom. She confirmed that the medical laboratory verified a complete absence of paternal genetic markers between Kelsey and the deceased. The judge then turned her attention to the specific, rigid language embedded within the testamentary trust established by our late father. She read the restrictive clauses aloud, emphasizing the explicit requirement that all beneficiaries must be direct biological descendants in order to inherit any portion of the agricultural assets or the subsequent commercial buyout proceeds. The legal framing left absolutely no room for interpretation, emotional appeals, or claims of implied paternity based on familial upbringing. Our father, driven by a deep-seated paranoia regarding his legacy, had instructed his attorneys to construct a fortress around his wealth, and that very fortress was now permanently locking out his favored child. Judge Collins delivered her final ruling without a trace of hesitation or sympathy. She stated clearly that because the medical evidence conclusively proved Kelsey possessed zero genetic relation to the deceased, she failed to meet the strict legal criteria established by the trust. Therefore, Kelsey was entirely and permanently excluded from receiving any distribution of the estate. The emergency injunction placed on the assets by Mr. Davis was formally dismissed. The temporary freeze was lifted, and I was officially named the sole rightful beneficiary of the multi-million-dollar agricultural land sale. The pronouncement landed in the silent courtroom with the devastating finality of a falling gavel. There was no dramatic gasp from a crowded gallery, no swelling cinematic music to signal the victory. The reaction was profoundly muted, characterized by a heavy, suffocating silence. Kelsey did not launch into a hysterical tirade or attempt to argue with the judge. She simply dropped her head into her hands, her shoulders shaking silently as silent tears slipped through her fingers. The arrogant fight had completely left her. The crushing reality of the verdict meant she was not only stripped of the inheritance she had built her identity upon, but she was now solely responsible for the massive, exorbitant legal bills generated by Mr. Davis's aggressive, Prolonged litigation tactics. The strategy to bleed me dry had ultimately resulted in her own absolute financial ruin. I looked back at the spectator seating. My mother remained entirely paralyzed, staring blankly at the judge's bench. The devastating reality of the ruling meant her infidelity, the secret she had guarded fiercely for 3 decades while projecting moral superiority, was now a permanent fixture in the Iowa legal archives. The pristine reputation she valued above her own children was entirely destroyed. A casualty of her own desperate attempt to manipulate the probate system. She did not look at me or attempt to offer an apology. She sat trapped in the wreckage of her own deception. I sat quietly beside Sarah, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not feel a sudden, euphoric rush of triumph or an overwhelming surge of vindication. The legal victory did not feel like a cinematic explosion of joy. It felt incredibly heavy, carrying the profound weight of the exhausting journey required to reach this point. The relentless anxiety of the frozen funds, the grueling double shifts at the grocery store, and the severe emotional trauma inflicted by my family had exacted a significant toll. The bureaucratic nightmare was finally over. But the emotional wreckage left scattered across the courtroom floor was profound and completely irreversible. The judge formally adjourned the hearing, striking her gavel against the sounding block before exiting the bench. Mr. Davis quickly gathered his files, stuffing them into his expensive leather briefcase with noticeable irritation. He offered Kelsey a curt, professional nod before hastily exiting the courtroom, eager to distance himself from a losing client who could no longer afford his exorbitant hourly rate. Kelsey remained seated, her face buried in her hands. Refusing to acknowledge my presence, Sarah placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, offering a small, tired smile. The contingency agreement had paid off, securing a massive financial windfall for her modest practice. But she recognized the emotional severity of the moment. She quietly informed me that the estate attorneys would handle the final transfer of the commercial buyout funds into my secure accounts within the next 48 hours. The multi-million-dollar legacy my father had aggressively protected was finally, legally mine. I stood up, my legs feeling slightly unsteady after months of bracing for impact. I gathered my worn purse and walked down the center aisle, passing my mother, who remained frozen in her seat. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the bustling corridor of the courthouse. The oppressive summer humidity hit me as I exited the building. But for the first time in 9 months, the air felt remarkably clean. The suffocating pressure of the legal battle had evaporated, replaced by a vast, intimidating horizon of absolute financial freedom. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the deeply ingrained toxic dynamics of my family rarely surrendered without a final, desperate struggle. The staggering influx of wealth I was about to receive represented a sudden, massive shift in our power structure. While the courtroom gavel had finalized the legal distribution, the emotional fallout was only just beginning. The realization that I now controlled the resources my sister desperately needed to avoid complete bankruptcy set the stage for a precarious, highly volatile confrontation. The battle for the inheritance was decisively won. But the true test of my resolve lay in navigating the desperate, manipulative aftermath that awaited me. The swift bureaucratic machinery of the commercial agricultural buyout finalized the estate transfer just 3 days after the judge delivered her absolute ruling. I sat on my faded, second-hand sofa, clutching a mug of cheap instant coffee, and logged into my newly established, highly secure banking portal. The screen loaded, displaying a balance that defied my lifelong reality. The multi-million-dollar proceeds from the Story County farmland sat securely in my name. A staggering sequence of numbers that permanently erased my grueling existence of double shifts and crushing debt. The suffocating anxiety of unpaid heating bills and looming eviction vanished instantly. However, as I stared at the glowing digits, the profound silence of my small apartment was shattered by the harsh, relentless buzzing of my cell phone. The toxic family dynamic. Severely damaged, but not entirely eradicated by the court decision, launched a desperate, frantic campaign to reassert control. The caller identification flashed my mother's name repeatedly, Sandra. Stripped of her pristine social standing and facing the humiliating public reality of her 30-year deception, reverted to her most potent weapon. She weaponized guilt. My voicemail inbox rapidly filled with a barrage of tearful, hysterical messages. Her tone lacked the arrogant, commanding authority she used to wield at Sunday dinners. Instead, she sounded erratic and desperate. She wept loudly through the speaker, graphically detailing the catastrophic collapse of Kelsey's life. The aggressive litigation tactics employed by Mr. Davis had generated astronomical legal fees, leaving my sister entirely bankrupt. The bank was actively initiating foreclosure proceedings on her heavily mortgaged townhouse. Sandra begged me to release a fraction of the inheritance to cover Kelsey's immediate debts, pleading with me to save our fractured family from total ruin. She attempted to manipulate my deeply ingrained sense of obligation, framing the massive financial bailout as a necessary act of sibling loyalty, completely ignoring the fact that they had spent the previous 9 months actively trying to bleed me dry in a courtroom. I did not delete the messages immediately, nor did I answer her frantic calls to engage in a bitter screaming match. The grueling legal battle had forged a new, impenetrable armor around my emotions. The terrified, obedient cashier who had absorbed their insults in silence was gone. I recognized that granting them unrestricted access to my newfound wealth would only validate their toxic behavior, effectively rewarding them for their cruel deception. I needed to sever the manipulative ties permanently, but I refused to stoop to their level of callous vindictiveness. The crushing empathy I had felt for Kelsey in the freezing grocery store parking lot lingered, a stark reminder of the immense, crushing pressure our father had placed upon her to perform the role of the successful golden child. I decided to orchestrate a final, definitive confrontation entirely on my own terms. I sent a brief text message to my mother, outlining a strict meeting time and a neutral location. I chose a quiet, independent coffee shop situated on the outskirts of Des Moines, far away from their affluent suburban neighborhoods and the judgmental gaze of Sandra's remaining church friends. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and rainy afternoons, providing a calm, unassuming backdrop for the termination of a 30-year toxic relationship. I arrived precisely on time, wearing a simple, tailored blouse that felt incredibly foreign compared to my usual polyester uniform. I sat at a small wooden table near the back, nursing a black coffee, projecting an aura of quiet, unyielding authority. Sandra and Kelsey entered the cafe 10 minutes later, bringing the chaotic, anxious energy of their impending ruin with them. Kelsey looked incredibly fragile, her usual designer armor replaced by a simple, wrinkled cardigan. The dark circles under her eyes testified to sleepless nights and mounting panic. Sandra flanked her, offering a tense, nervous smile that failed to reach her eyes. They took their seats across from me, the small wooden table acting as a physical barrier between my secure reality and their collapsing world. Sandra immediately leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together, preparing to launch into a rehearsed, emotional plea. I raised a single, authoritative hand, mirroring the precise, commanding gesture Sarah had used to silence opposing counsel during my deposition. The movement effectively halted my mother's performance before she could utter a single syllable. I looked directly at the two women who had spent my entire life diminishing my worth. I did not raise my voice or sneer with victorious arrogance. I spoke with a calm, measured detachment that left absolutely no room for negotiation or emotional manipulation. I addressed Kelsey directly. I acknowledged the severe, suffocating expectations our father had forced upon her, recognizing the immense psychological toll of constantly trying to embody a legacy that was built on a fundamental lie. I told her I understood the desperate, crushing fear that drove her to finance a fake reality, recognizing that she was a victim of our parents' deception just as much as I was. Then, I reached into my leather purse and withdrew a crisp, printed banking confirmation document. I slid the paper smoothly across the table, stopping it exactly in front of my sister. Kelsey stared at the document, her brow furrowing in confusion. Her eyes scanned the official bank seal and the highlighted transaction details. I informed them that I had initiated a direct, untraceable wire transfer to the primary lending institution holding the mortgage on Kelsey's townhouse. I had paid off the immediate housing arrears, clearing the aggressive late penalties and halting the active foreclosure proceedings. The payment ensured that Kelsey would not become homeless in the middle of the Iowa summer. It was a substantial, life-saving sum of money. An act of grace that completely contradicted the ruthless villain narrative they had constructed about me. Kelsey's hands began to shake violently as she gripped the confirmation paper. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a staggering mixture of profound relief and deep, humiliating confusion. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a frantic apology or a tearful expression of gratitude. But I quickly raised my hand again to maintain absolute control of the narrative. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a serious, unyielding register. I explicitly stated that the financial pipeline ended permanently with that single transaction. I clarified that I was not paying her exorbitant legal fees. I was not clearing her maxed-out credit cards. And I was absolutely not funding the resurrection of her failed luxury real estate business. The mortgage rescue was a final, parting gesture designed to provide her with a stable foundation to rebuild her life on her own terms, completely stripped of our father's toxic expectations. I shifted my gaze to Sandra, whose face was pale and tight with suppressed panic. I told her that I refused to carry the suffocating burden of her deceit any longer. I refused to apologize for legally receiving the inheritance that rightfully belonged to me. And I refused to remain tethered to a family dynamic that required my subjugation to maintain their comfort. I pulled a second document from my purse, a formal cease and desist letter drafted by Sarah's office. I placed it gently on the table. The legal notice clearly stipulated that any further attempts to contact me, solicit funds, or harass me through third parties would result in immediate, severe legal retaliation. The conversation was messy and deeply painful. Sandra began to cry. Actual, genuine tears of loss, realizing that the compliant daughter she had always taken for granted was permanently gone. Kelsey remained completely silent, clutching the mortgage confirmation to her chest like a physical lifeline. The reality of her newfound, terrifying independence settling heavily over her. I did not wait for their apologies or offer false promises of future reconciliation. I stood up, smoothing my blouse, and walked out of the quiet coffee shop. The heavy glass door swung shut behind me, severing the toxic connection with a final, definitive click. The ironclad boundaries were successfully established, providing the absolute security necessary for my survival. I stepped into the warm afternoon sun, breathing in the fresh air, entirely unburdened by the ghosts of my past. The agonizing legal war was won. The defensive perimeter was secured, and the vast, untouched expanse of my new life awaited my direction. The millions of dollars resting safely in my accounts offered limitless possibilities, demanding a deliberate, meaningful choice about how to construct a future that honored my intense struggle without replicating the arrogant mistakes of the family I had left behind. 1 year has passed since the heavy wooden doors of the Polk County Courthouse swung shut on the darkest chapter of my history. The bitter, biting Iowa winter eventually surrendered to a humid, vibrant July. The endless fields of corn and soybeans stretching across the Central Plains have grown tall and green, swaying under the vast Midwestern sky. I am no longer standing behind a worn cash register. I no longer wear a faded polyester polo shirt, nor do I spend my evenings calculating how many meals I can stretch from a single bag of rice. The constant, Gnawing anxiety over utility bills and late notices is a distant, fading memory. Using a strategic portion of the agricultural trust disbursement, I purchased a small, thriving commercial bakery located in the charming neighboring town of Pella. The transition felt natural, an authentic channel for the relentless blue-collar work ethic that has always defined my character. Every morning begins long before the sun crests the horizon. I unlock the front door of my shop, inhaling the rich, comforting aromas of sweet yeast, roasted espresso beans, and warm cinnamon. It is a profound upgrade from the sterile, industrial odor of bleached cardboard and floor wax that haunted my previous decade. The bakery features exposed brick walls, vintage display cases, and large front windows that invite the morning light. I employ a dedicated staff of 5 local residents, paying them a thriving living wage, ensuring they never have to experience the suffocating financial desperation I once endured. My hands are constantly dusted with flour, a physical testament to a life built on honest, independent labor rather than inherited. Toxic expectations. The multi-million-dollar estate, secure in a diversified investment portfolio, guarantees my financial safety. But this bustling storefront provides my soul with tangible, daily purpose. During late summer, when the annual Ragbri bicycle ride routes through our county, the shop brims with energetic travelers, reinforcing my deep connection to this community. The true reward of the inheritance, however, extends far beyond financial independence. The genetic testing kit unspooled a thread that led me to a genuine, grounded family connection. Sitting at a quiet corner table near the bakery window this morning is Helen, my late father's paternal aunt, the same woman whose biological markers validated my rightful claim to the trust. During the grueling probate process, I gathered the courage to reach out to her cattle property near Dubuque, instead of the stern, unapproachable figure I remembered from my youth. I found a pragmatic, fiercely intelligent woman who welcomed me with open arms. Helen visits the bakery every Tuesday, ordering a simple black coffee and a fresh pastry. We spend hours talking. She shares unvarnished, authentic stories about my father's early years, providing a nuanced perspective that softens the harsh, critical image I carried for so long. Through Helen, I finally discovered the familial warmth and unconditional acceptance that was always missing from my childhood. She represents the authentic bloodline, offering a supportive relationship untainted by superficial judgment. News travels with incredible speed across the tight-knit communities of central Iowa. The local diners and church pews inevitably became a hub for hushed gossip regarding the dramatic collapse of my former family structure. Sandra could not endure the microscopic scrutiny of her congregation. The exposure of her 30-year deception shattered the pristine, moralistic facade she had cultivated for decades. Unable to face the judgmental whispers echoing through the grocery store aisles and community bake sales, she quietly listed her suburban home for sale. She relocated to a retirement community in Central Florida, fleeing the state to salvage whatever dignity she could muster among strangers who knew nothing of her past. Her departure was swift and devoid of any farewells. A final retreat from a reality she refused to acknowledge. The distance provides a necessary buffer, ensuring her manipulative tactics can no longer disrupt my hard-won tranquility. Kelsey experienced a much different, sobering transformation. The single mortgage payment I provided granted her a brief, crucial window to restructure her disastrous financial situation, but it did not save her artificial empire. Her luxury real estate business, built on a foundation of exorbitant debt and projected superiority, inevitably folded. Without the phantom promise of the agricultural buyout to secure further credit, she was forced to sell her townhouse at a significant loss to appease her remaining creditors. The designer wardrobe and the leased vehicles were repossessed or liquidated. According to the pervasive local rumors, Kelsey now rents a modest, unassuming apartment on the western edge of Des Moines. She secured a standard administrative position at a regional insurance firm, clocking in for a predictable 9 to 5 shift. The surprising reality of Kelsey's downfall is the distinct lack of tragedy surrounding it. People who interact with her report a stark change in her demeanor. The hostile litigator persona has dissolved. Stripped of the suffocating, impossible expectations our father placed upon her, she no longer needs to perform. She is no longer drowning in the toxic pressure to prove her worth through material excess. The crushing weight of a legacy she never biologically belonged to is gone. In a strange, twisted way, the loss of the inheritance liberated her from a life of perpetual, exhausting deception. I do not harbor ill will toward her anymore. The physical and emotional distance between us is vast, providing a protective barrier that allows both of us to exist in our separate, disparate realities. We will never share Sunday dinners again. But the severance brought a bizarre, mutual salvation. I wiped down the flour-dusted counter, looking out the large glass storefront as the morning commuter traffic picks up along the main street. The sun climbs higher, casting a warm, golden glow across the brick pavement. I pour myself a fresh cup of coffee, the steam curling upward into the cool, air-conditioned air of the shop. A local farmer stops by to pick up a box of pastries, tipping his hat and chatting briefly about the upcoming sweet corn harvest. The simple, neighborly kindness reflects the true spirit of the heartland, a culture defined by mutual respect rather than cutthroat competition. I take a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the profound tranquility of the moment settle deep into my bones. The journey from a terrified, exhausted cashier to a secure, independent business owner demanded an excruciating toll, but the clarity I gained is invaluable. I realize now that true power does not reside in exacting ruthless vengeance or destroying the people who caused you pain. True power is the quiet, unyielding ability to build a secure, peaceful sanctuary entirely outside of their shadow. The malicious birthday gift, handed to me in a crowded diner with the intent to humiliate and demean, operated as the ultimate catalyst. Kelsey intended the commercial DNA swab to be a cruel, public joke, a weapon to cement my status as the outcast. Instead, that small plastic vial became the precise, irrefutable key that unlocked my ultimate freedom. It severed the toxic chains of obligation and exposed the hidden truths, clearing the path for a future defined by authenticity rather than manipulation. The peace I hold today was hard-won, forged in the fires of a grueling probate war and sustained by the rigid boundaries I erected to protect my newfound life. What boundary will you set today to protect your own peace and future? As I lock the front door of my bakery and watch the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the Iowa pavement, the quiet hum of the cooling ovens offers a rhythm I have grown to cherish deeply. The stark contrast between this serene, flower-dusted haven and the harsh, grease-stained Altoona diner from a year ago remains a constant source of wonder. Looking back at the grueling probate battle, the frozen accounts, and the crumbling facade of my mother and sister, I recognize that surviving the wreckage required far more than just a competent attorney. It demanded a fundamental restructuring of how I viewed the world and my place within it. Through the ashes of my former life, I absorbed 5 distinct truths. First, I learned that biology is merely a starting point, not a binding contract for your self-worth. For 32 years, I allowed my lack of physical resemblance to my father to serve as a silent justification for my mistreatment, letting my mother's coldness convince me I was inherently flawed. The truth revealed that my value was never the issue. Their deeply rooted deception was. Real family is forged through mutual respect and honesty, much like the authentic bond I now share with Aunt Helen, not through the fragile preservation of a pristine social image. Second, establishing ironclad boundaries is a profound, necessary act of self-preservation. When my mother wept on my cheap apartment rug, pleading with me to surrender my future to save her church-going reputation, yielding would have been the easiest route. Standing firm felt agonizing in the moment. Yet, refusing to remain the designated scapegoat taught me that you cannot heal in the very environment that fractured your spirit. You must construct a formidable wall to guard your peace. Third, there is an unmatched, enduring security in authentic, honest labor. Kelsey constructed her identity on a mountain of revolving debt and unearned expectations, relying entirely on a legacy she assumed was her birthright. When the medical facts shattered her facade, she possessed no foundation to break her fall. My years enduring grueling double shifts at the grocery store taught me how to survive on my own merits. When the windfall finally cleared the escrow accounts, I channeled it into building a tangible, sustainable business, rather than funding a flashy, hollow persona. Fourth, true vindication does not require you to adopt the cruelty of your abusers. It was incredibly tempting to leverage my newfound resources to crush my sister when her real estate business faltered. Choosing to cover her immediate housing arrears before permanently severing ties was not an act of weakness. It provided the ultimate closure. It proved that I could transcend their toxic cycle. Cultivating a beautiful, quiet life outside of their shadow is infinitely more rewarding than seeking their active downfall. Finally, I learned that the very weapons meant to harm you can magically transform into the keys to your liberation. That commercial DNA kit was intended as a cruel punchline to degrade me in front of a crowded restaurant. Instead, it dismantled a 30-year lie and delivered the exact empirical evidence needed to secure my rightful independence. We all encounter individuals who try to project their own deep-seated insecurities onto us, hoping to keep us small. Have you ever turned a painful betrayal into the foundation of your own independent success? Share your personal journey in the comments below. If you found strength in this journey, please hit the like button and subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories for more narratives about reclaiming your truth.